Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank Gail Brown and the Poetry Center for inviting me to this panel discussion. I just want to mention a few more Sobin words: mirror, octave, wind, relic, and breath, which I think is a very important word in Sobin's work.
Teddy,
yes,
I think we need the microphone.
My voice is very low.
Just turned it on. Okay.
I was just mentioning about the other Sobin words like mirror, octave, wind, relic, and breath, which are constant in Sobin's work, and also towards, impelled, and attracted. But I'm going to speak, my subject is really about translating Sobin and how I got to know his work. This was in 1992, where an anthology of North American poetry was published in Mexico by Elliot Weinberger. This anthology went from William Carlos Williams to Michael Palmer. And that's where I read Gustaf Sobin for the first time. There were two long poems in this anthology. One was Girandol, and the other one was Irises. And I immediately was very struck by Sobin's work, and I decided that I wanted to translate him. I was living in Paris at that time, and there was a very good bookstore called The Village Voice, which I visited very frequently. I went there to look for Sobin's books, and there were three of his books there. And I asked the owner of the bookstore, who was a very well-read woman, French woman, if she knew about Gustaf Sobin. And she told me that Gustaf Sobin lived in a very, very small village in the south of France called Les Maquignons. So that's where my research, my investigation started. I returned to Mexico in 1994. I got in touch with Elliot Weinberger. I asked him if he knew anything about Gustaf Sobin. He immediately was very enthusiastic about my project of translating Sobin. So he wrote to Sobin to introduce me, and then I wrote to Sobin, which was really, communicating with Sobin was always very slow, because he was really, it's true, he had a fax machine about a year after I got in touch with him. Other than that, it was just by mail, really very, very slow mail. I remember Sobin's handwriting, which was very particular. And well, we immediately started to work together. I got all of Sobin's books to that point, because of course the last ones were not included. And I made a selection of 59 poems. And I presented this as a project for a grant that's funded by Mexico and the United States. And I was given this grant. And of course, in my project, I included a trip to Les Maquignons to visit Gustaf Sobin. So I went to Les Maquignons in 1995. It was a very long trip, first to Paris, then to Avignon, and then finally to that very, very small town of Les Maquignons, which is really only Sobin's house, and about a kilometer away from Sobin's house, a Romanesque chapel called San Beran, which was where Samberan slayed a dragon in the Middle Ages. So that's the closest to reality that Sobin lived, was where a dragon was slain in the Middle Ages. So I worked with Sobin 2 or 3 days on the poems, which were already translated in a Spanish rough version. And it was a strange way of working, because Sobin was not familiar with Spanish. And so I really could only ask him not about precise words, but about meanings. Because finally, in a way, Sobin's poetry is like scenery in slow motion, landscape in slow motion, words in slow motion. So and it's very foreign to Spanish sounds, and very foreign to Spanish strophe, I would call it. No, let's say the way the line falls in Spanish. The words are longer. It's probably Spanish verse is probably slower than verse in English. So it was very difficult to fit that into Spanish, no? And to the sounds of Spanish. But I think with Sobin's help, it was very interesting work, and it was interesting to see where Sobin lived, because the house was one of those old stone houses in the south of France, and Sobin worked in a place he called Cabagnon, which is a small cabin with a very, very small window. And it's strange that Sobin, whose poetry was so much about landscape, he never looked out the window while he was writing, because he thought that was cheating. You had no right to see the landscape while you were writing. So you always wrote with his back against the window. And it was a very small room. There was no space for anything but for Sobin. So this sense of place gave my translation a sense of place. And finally, when I finished, well, of course, I discovered other facets of Sobin. Sobin the wanderer, Sobin the walker, Sobin the archaeologist, because Sobin was really, he picked up pieces of stone while he walked. After all, Provence is a place filled, cluttered with history. And Sobin really had his own personal collection of, his own minimalist museum at his house. And he had a lot of very valuable pieces. And a lot of his prose writing is about this museum that he had at his house. So walking with him in Provence was really quite an experience. It was filled with details, ways of looking at stones, ways of looking at leaves, ways of looking at grass, ways of looking at ferns. So it was really, for me, it was, I think in a way, poetry in Spanish lacks landscape. For some strange reason, we don't have that tradition. And Sobin gave me, for my own work, a sense of landscape. I think that's basically what I wanted to say. The book is here, and I'll probably read something in Spanish tonight.
I'll try to do without the mic. If people have problems hearing, just let me know. I'm going to talk about Sobin's relationship to the French poet René Char. It's really hard to understand what Sobin was up to without understanding this relationship. René Char, the name is spelled C-H-A-R, was the whole reason Sobin ended up in France, in the south of France, spending most of his life there. So I'll just quickly give you a sense of who Char was. I think it's fair to say that René Char was one of the most important French poets of the 20th century. He died in '88, and he was a big, tall, strong, magnetic man. It's easy to imagine a young American poet going to Paris and encountering him and falling under his spell. He had both his work and his personality were of volcanic intensity. René Char started out as a surrealist, and the surrealists would sometimes brawl with other poets. These were the days when poets would fight with each other, physically fight, and the surrealists would always bring René Char along. He's a big brute. He could pound any opponent into submission. After the time of the surrealists and the beginning of World War II, René Char became a captain in the French resistance. Just another indication of his strength and physicality, and that really comes through in his poetry and writing, which was very modern, but full of disjunction and fragmentation, but visceral and sensual and volcanic at the same time. Char even used some codes of the resistance as part of his poetry. The title of one of his books is "The Library is on Fire," which was a resistance code. This is the man that Sobin, when he was a young poet, well, he wasn't even writing poetry at that point, an aspiring poet. This is the man that Sobin met when he came to Paris in the early 60s. And as Char usually did with people that he took a liking to, he invited Sobin down to Provence, where Char lived, and said, "If you're so interested in me and my poetry, you have to come and see where I live." And Sobin did exactly that. He went down to, not only did he visit Char in Provence, but he ended up buying the stone cottage that Teddy talked about. He said he bought it for $800, and he lived there for the rest of his life, raised a family there. And he had a falling out with Char for part of that period, but in the early days, he was. I think it's fair to say there was a master-apprentice relationship going on. And one thing that happened during that apprentice period was that Char had a series of meetings with the German philosopher Martin Heidegger that Andrew alluded to